Welcome to our webinar. This is an EdTPA Elementary Education Overview of Task 4 for elementary completing teacher candidates in Wisconsin, New York, or Georgia. My name is Tracy Vasquez, and I'm here with Grand Canyon University in the College of Education. This webinar is intended for our spring 2017 teacher candidates. And at this point, I would imagine you are fairly well through your EdTPA. You may just be getting started on Task 4, or you may have already started Task 4. But this will be an interactive discussion, so if you do have any questions or comments throughout the presentation, please raise the hand icon next to your name, and I'll be able to unmute you so that you can address the group. Also, this webinar is being recorded, so if you do contribute vocally during the presentation, that will also be recorded, and we are going to be posting this recording on our Professional Learning Network. So this will be for understanding Task 4. So to start out, let's cover Task 4 with a description. We know that Task 4 does require you to analyze evidence of student learning of mathematics from one assessment completed by a whole class of students. Now keep in mind, this does not necessarily mean the whole class that you have for your student teaching. It could be a group of students who you're calling the whole class for this task. Does not have to be the exact same students that you used for your previous 3 tasks. It does not have to be the same students at all. However, it does make it easier if you're still with those same students because you have knowledge of their background, prior learning. So the assessment that you're using is going to have to come from the learning segment that you design for the students. So it may be taught by you or it may be taught by the classroom teacher, but we're focusing on one learning segment for math. And then we're going to be focusing on one assessment from that learning segment. So based on your analysis of the assessment, you're going to plan and teach a re-engagement lesson. So we can think of this like any other daily classroom routine. When you're teaching a learning segment to your students, likely you have one or several students who did not grasp the objective, and you're going to have to reteach some content to them. So think about how you typically reteach or re-engage students and how you ensure you're meeting all of your students' learning needs. So for this webinar, we will understand the requirements of Task 4, understand how to meet the specific expectations of each piece of evidence needed for Task 4. We will be discussing how to analyze student work and to understand re-engagement planning. Okay, we have a question. Where on the PLN will this be available after the webinar ends? We will be posting this in the elementary education folder. So if you go to our EdTPA group space and then to the content-specific materials, that's where you'll see individual folders by content area. This is specific for elementary education, so we will be holding it in the elementary education folder. May not have it up necessarily today, but we'll definitely get it up in the next day or so. But I will be sending you a copy of this presentation, the slides, so you'll be able to reference any of the content covered. Great questions. Okay, what are we going to think about? How will you analyze whole class evidence to identify patterns of learning? So think about how you typically look at assessments that you give to your students and how you identify patterns of learning. How will you use student work to analyze mathematical errors, confusions, and partial understandings? Usually this is fairly straightforward with mathematical lessons. We always ask our students to show their work, whereas the work that is shown typically demonstrates the type of errors that they're having. So you can see where students are coming to misunderstand the mathematical procedures. How will you re-engage students in learning to address identified areas of challenge or need? Remember, when you typically address reteaching content, it's for a student or group of students who have a specific learning need, and you have to tailor the instruction to meet those areas of need. How do you use evidence of student learning to reflect on the effectiveness of your re-engagement lesson? So now we're thinking about, do we know the re-engagement or the reteach was effective? How do we know that? Typically that's by looking at the assessments. So let's start with the beginning. First thing for task 4 is set the context. Now, earlier I did say we were working with a class, but it is also a group. So you may not necessarily be teaching this portion, task 4, to all 26 students in your class. You may only use a group of 4 and consider that your class or group for task 4. You also will need to complete the Elementary Mathematics Context for Learning Information template. It is similar to the template you complete for the literacy portion. However, you do have to make sure you're doing this on the Mathematics Context for Learning Information template. And as I said earlier, this does not have to be the same group of students, although it can be. You still have to complete this Context for Learning Information template fresh in just as much detail as you would for the literacy portion. Now I'll be giving you an overview of task 4. So this is the task 4 flowchart. This is how it will all fit together. You'll first have the learning segment, those 3 to 5 lessons. They will all be on a central focus, addressing state standards, learning objectives, and they will include instructional strategies to meet the needs of that whole class or group. Within that learning segment, there is also a formative assessment built in, and this is how you will evaluate understanding or thinking through student responses or work. After the formative assessment takes place, we can analyze the student work. We're going to look for quantitative and qualitative patterns. We will select 3 work samples, and we will use concrete evidence of errors, confusions, and partial understandings that are demonstrated on the assessment. Next comes the re-engagement lesson. This is a lesson that you plan. You will be using 3 student work samples from the formative assessment taught in the learning segment. You will need to set a learning objective or goal for the re-engagement lesson, and you will need to design the re-engagement lesson. Next comes the work samples. And with the work samples, you will assess the work samples for new evidence of understandings demonstrating conceptual understanding, computational, procedural fluency, and mathematical reasoning, problem-solving skills. So a very close look at those work samples. A big emphasis of task 4 is the assessment of those re-engagement work samples. So let's take a closer look at the learning segment and formative assessment. These really go hand in hand because remember the formative assessment is part of the learning segment. So the first thing is to choose a central focus. And you will need to identify the central focus for this math learning segment before you plan and teach the learning segment. So you'll want to collaborate with your cooperating teacher to decide what would be a good central focus to teach this class or group. You want to use a specific mathematics topic that the students have not yet mastered, and any topic that relates to your students' learning needs should reflect a balanced approach to mathematics that will allow students to demonstrate conceptual understanding, procedural fluency, mathematical reasoning, problem-solving skills. We'll talk more about the meanings of each of those words later in the presentation. But right now, I just want you to understand the learning segment does have to include a central focus that is going to allow students to demonstrate each of these key abilities. Next, you're going to plan the learning segment and the formative assessment. And this can be done with your cooperating teacher. You will identify the learning segment, and you will include the formative assessment. Now, you're not writing full lesson plans for each of these 3 to 5 lessons like you are for the literacy portion. Remember, in tasks 1 through 3, you had to write full lesson plans for the learning segment. That is not the case with task 4. You only have to fill out this template or chart that shows that you have an understanding of what's going to be covered in the learning segment. Now, for the formative assessment, you are going to be capturing data for your whole class or group, and you also need to ensure that students show conceptual understanding, procedural fluency, mathematical reasoning, and problem solving. And you will allow for the assessment to show differences in student skills and understandings related to the topic. You will later analyze for areas of struggle, misconception, or misunderstanding, and you will need to select 3 focus students. And you will need to submit a blank copy, including instructions for your assessment. And you'll also need to define the evaluation criteria. How will you be evaluating this assessment? Whether that be on a rubric or whatnot, you must know how you will be evaluating the assessment. So this is the elementary mathematics learning segment overview. You'll see I have a picture of it here on the right. This is what it looks like. So you will be filling out this template overview for your learning segment for the math task 4. So you do see here that you have an overview of each of the 3 lessons for the learning segment. It is not a full lesson plan, but there are specific components that need to be addressed. You need the learning objectives. You also need instructional strategies and learning tasks, and you need formative and summative assessments for each lesson. And now, once all of the lessons have been planned for your learning segment for task 4 math, you will be ready to teach the learning segment. So now you're going to teach the learning segment to your whole class or group. And next comes analyze student work. So you will need to collect and analyze the student work. We will be looking for quantitative and qualitative patterns in the evidence. And think through these questions. What responses are constantly right or wrong? That's how we look for a pattern. Did John miss adding up the numbers correctly? Did Sally miss adding? Did Johnny miss adding? What is everyone doing right or wrong? How many students did or did not meet a specific criteria? Remember when we discussed how you were going to be evaluating the student work? So that evaluation probably has criteria. Look for evidence of what they have learned and what they understand. Remember that assessment should demonstrate what they have learned and understand. That's why we ask them to show their work. We're going to be looking for concrete evidence and examples of mathematical errors, confusions, and partial understanding. Again, that's why we have students show their work when they're doing mathematical assessments. We want to really get down into the nitty-gritty of the process that they're using. What do we see that shows us they do or do not understand? That is the concrete evidence. Again, looking for quantitative and qualitative patterns of errors. So here are a couple sentence starters for how you can refer to the use of concrete evidence. You may say, many students showed that they could add, subtract, multiply. However, one student did not demonstrate that he could multiply because I saw this and this in his student work. As we can see in student number 1's work on problem number 2, he did not carry the 1 in his addition problem. This demonstrates partial understanding, confusion. This is unlike most of the class. Like most of the class, student number 2 and 3 showed in problem 6 that they could not subtract because we saw they did not cross out the 0 to borrow from the tens place. This demonstrates a common area of confusion, a pattern of consistently wrong subtraction. Would anyone like to share an example of how they could analyze a mathematical assessment and find concrete evidence? Perhaps you've already been grading math assignments or assessments. Have you been able to pinpoint concrete evidence that shows students know or do not know the process? Yeah, this is a bit of a challenging concept, but remember, the reason we have students complete assessments is because we want to look at their thinking process. We want to know what they can and can't do. So whichever assessment you use for your learning segment should be demonstrative of what students can and cannot do. And when you collect their assessments and you analyze them, there should be some areas that you can point to that show you why you think they understand or do not understand the concept. Because they may have made a particular mistake or because they got everything right. So how do you know if they're understanding? Because we have to be able to pinpoint specific evidence. If this is a concept that's difficult to you, you could certainly collaborate with your cooperating teacher to find out, generally, how does your cooperating teacher analyze student work? How does he or she identify concrete evidence that demonstrates student learning or lack of learning? You can certainly do that before task 4 so that you have a very specific understanding of what you'll need to do to find concrete evidence in your assessment data. Now, when we're analyzing the assessments, we will need to use 3 focus students. So we're going to select 3 focus students with a specific need. Like I said earlier, maybe you saw Sally and Johnny and Jane all demonstrated the same error. Then you know they all have the same pattern of misconception, and they all have the same learning need. So we have the specific evidence, we have the focus students, and we have the specific need. So you'll be selecting 3 student work samples that provide evidence of the specific struggle. Now, at least one of the students out of your 3 focus students must have a specific learning need. So that could be a student with an IEP plan or 504 plan. It could be an English language learner, a struggling reader, or an underperforming student, or a student with gaps in academic knowledge, or a gifted student needing greater support or challenge. So you'll be analyzing the work of your 3 focus students. This can be in written, audio, or video format. You'll be looking at evidence of their struggle, concrete evidence, and you'll explain how their struggle is related to mathematical understanding or misunderstanding. Now this is important. What do the students' errors tell you about their mathematical understanding? It's no longer sufficient for teachers just to say, Johnny got 15 right and 5 wrong. We have to really be able to look at the errors and determine, how does this reflect student learning? Is this student understanding the lesson or not? And the way we measure understanding is through the assessment. So we're going to look at, what do the students' errors tell you about their mathematical understanding? Here are a couple of examples. If a student error occurs in a subtraction problem, then the underlying mathematical understanding may include regrouping, the meaning of subtraction, and/or subtraction as the inverse of addition. The related mathematical understanding becomes the basis for the targeted learning objective goal for the students. So we have to look deeper into the problem and the student's process. It isn't just that he got the subtraction problem wrong, but what did he do wrong, and how is this reflective of his mathematical understanding related to the learning objective? Here's another example. If the identified struggle were with regrouping, you would look at work samples to see what the students' errors tell you about their understanding of regrouping. You could point to a specific example in an error in the student work. The student didn't change the number of tens, and relate it to the skills and understanding needed. When regrouping, the number of tens lessens by 1 if 10 is added to the ones place. So if Johnny did not demonstrate his knowledge of that skill, what would you see in his error? And when you see that error, pinpoint that error. That is your concrete evidence. So not only do we need to analyze their student work, we need to find the concrete evidence, and we need to determine what this tells us about their mathematical understanding. What skills are they missing? And once you have identified what skills they are missing, for example, the regrouping, you're ready for the re-engagement lesson. The re-engagement lesson uses 3 work samples, sets a learning objective, goal, and designs a re-engagement lesson. So you'll need to respond to student needs. A key aspect of effective teaching involves responding to student needs that surface during instruction. Teachers may respond by building upon what students already learned in order to extend or deepen their knowledge, or by revisiting a topic taught in the lesson or a previous lesson that may not yet be fully understood by the students. So what we need to know here is next steps for instructions are always reflective of student needs. We never plan to go on to division until our students have shown us they are sufficient in their multiplication skills. And when revisiting a topic, effective teachers use a different approach with the assumption that the first approach did not work for all students. So that's important. Remember, a big part of task 4 is your re-engagement lesson plan. That's separate from the learning segment for math. The re-engagement lesson plan is reteaching that group of students that demonstrated a misconception. So if they misunderstood the first time, you need to try a different approach the second time. Reteaching them should use a different approach. For task 4, you must re-engage the students in the area of struggle that you identified in the analysis of the focus students' work samples. So remember, we looked at the focus students' work samples. We determined that the focus students all had the same pattern of misconception, and you're going to re-engage them based on that area of struggle. So for re-engagement planning, you're using the student struggles that you identified in the analysis of the 3 student work samples. You'll set a learning objective and goal for the re-engagement lesson and design the re-engagement lesson. Your instruction of the re-engagement portion is going to respond to the students' needs that we saw in the original work samples. So we know what their misconceptions are. How is our re-engagement lesson plan addressing these misconceptions? As you plan the re-engagement lesson, keep in mind how you will demonstrate your students' growth by pinpointing concrete evidence, as well as explain how your instruction impacted their learning. You should be able to see that through formative assessments. Okay, we have a question here. When going through the re-engagement phase, should we focus only on the focus students, or should this be a whole group lesson? Good question. This is only going to focus on the focus students. Because remember, when we were analyzing the formative assessment from the learning segment, we saw that there was a pattern of misconception. If only Johnny and Sally and Jane have the misconception, that only they need to be retaught or re-engaged. So we're focusing just on those students. So for the re-engagement portion, you're going to need a learning objective, a re-engagement lesson plan, and you're going to need to teach the re-engagement lesson plan to your focus students. Your instruction should be specifically responsive to the original misconceptions that we found in that assessment from the learning segment. So remember, for task 4, the first thing is identifying what your students need to know. And from there, you're creating the learning segment, those 3 to 5 math lessons. And those include a formative assessment. And when you analyze that formative assessment, you'll find a pattern of misconception. And you'll identify those students. Those will be your focus students. And with those students, you will plan a re-engagement lesson with different instructional strategies than were used the first time. And finally, we have to assess the work samples of our re-engagement lesson. These work samples should demonstrate conceptual understanding, computational, procedural fluency, mathematical reasoning, problem-solving skills. So you will collect and submit the 3 focus students' work samples from your re-engagement lesson. Analyze for new evidence of understandings, and evaluate the effectiveness of the re-engagement lesson. Next comes the mathematics assessment commentary. Now, the mathematics assessment commentary is really where this all comes together. Because, as you know, commentaries are more like long essays, reflective essays in which you discuss everything that took place during the task. So your assessment commentary will include analyzing student learning for the whole class, or whatever that original group was that you used with the math learning segment. And then you'll also be including analysis of the student learning for the 3 focus students. You'll include analyzing your own teaching and developing students' mathematical understanding. And just like the other commentaries you've completed in tasks 1 through 3, there are prompts that will guide you through completing this mathematics assessment commentary. The key here is that you are very specific in why you do what you do, what adjustments you've made for reteaching, and how that has helped your focus students, and how you know it has helped them. And you'll know that from the final assessment from the re-engagement lesson. And you're going to be attaching the assessments from the re-engagement lesson. So here's some important information. Key points for task 4. We do need to include a copy of the actual assessment from the original learning segment. Remember, this is our task 4 mathematics learning segment of 3 to 5 lessons that is taught by you or the teacher. You'll need a graphic, a table or chart. It says or narrative, but I would suggest you include a graphic and a narrative summary of the performance of the class on the assessment from the original learning segment. Then you'll need 3 student work samples from the original learning segment and 3 work samples from the same students from the re-engagement lesson. And you'll need specific evidence from student work to support your evaluation of the re-engagement lesson. That's going to be proof that the re-engagement lesson plan was effective or not effective. So what to avoid? These are important points because often these can give you either an automatic 1 or an incomplete score. These can be dangerous. Significant content inaccuracies in your analysis. Targeted learning objective goal for the re-engagement lesson is not aligned with the identified area of struggle. So if all of your students demonstrate a particular area of struggle or a pattern of misunderstanding, your targeted learning objective for the re-engagement lesson needs to address that area of struggle. Also, what to avoid? Citation of evidence of student learning is not aligned with the student work samples. Reteaching without any changes the original lesson as your re-engagement lesson. Remember, we discussed, when you reteach, you need to use different strategies. You cannot reteach using the same strategies that were used the first time because obviously the students did not understand. So we need to support them with modified instructional plans. Now this is what you really want to know, the key terms of the rubric. It is very, very important that you understand these terms so that you can ensure to include them in your commentaries. Aligned, that makes sure that the standards, learning objectives, evaluation criteria, summary, and analysis are all aligned. That means they consistently address the same learning outcomes or the same learning segment. Procedural fluency. That's knowledge of when and how to use particular procedures. Significant content inaccuracies. That's when you make content flaws in commentary explanations, lesson plans, or instructional materials that will lead to student misunderstandings. If you're teaching the content wrong, that's a content inaccuracy. Conceptual understanding is when students demonstrate conceptual understanding. They recognize, label, and generate examples of concepts. They use models, diagrams, manipulatives. They show that they understand what to do. That's a conceptual understanding. Mathematical reasoning is the capacity to think logically about the relationships among concepts and situations. Such reasoning is correct and valid, stems from careful consideration of alternatives, and includes knowledge of how to justify the conclusions. One uses it to navigate through the many facts, procedures, concepts, and solution methods, and to see that they all fit together in some way and that they make sense. Patterns of learning. Quantitative and qualitative patterns for different groups of students or individuals. Quantitative patterns include a numerical way for information to be understood. 10 out of 15 students got this correct. Qualitative patterns include descriptions of understandings, misunderstandings, partial understandings, and/or developmental approximations. So it isn't enough for us to say 15 out of 20 students don't know how to subtract. We have to be very specific about exactly what do they not understand about subtraction. And you can see more about these mathematical terms in the mathematics-specific glossary of terms, which is located in the EdTPA Elementary Education Handbook. I also want to show you the Task 4 rubrics. These are the rubrics that are used by the Pearson EdTPA scorers to evaluate the quality of your work in Task 4. So rubric 16 They will be measuring your effectiveness analyzing whole class understandings. So remember, this comes from your analysis of the original formative assessment from the 3 to 5 lessons of learning segment. Looking at level 3, we want to make sure we identify what students did right and wrong related to conceptual understanding and procedural fluency or mathematical reasoning problem solving. Rubric 17 measures our capacity for analyzing individual student work samples. So this is now when we have our focus students. The candidate uses evidence from the 3 focus student work samples to identify specific student struggles, errors, confusions, or partial understandings. Remember, we have to use that concrete evidence. Rubric 18, using evidence to reflect on teaching. How do we use evidence to inform our progress teaching? How does the candidate examine the re-engagement lesson to further student learning? Looking at level 3 here, the candidate uses evidence of student learning from the 3 student work samples to describe whether or not the re-engagement strategy was effective. Remember, we need to refer to those concrete evidence pieces from the work samples. And from that, we can make a decision. Do the students understand the topic now, the objective? Do they now understand, or do they still not understand? Was the re-engagement strategy effective, or was it not effective? What evidence do we have to tell us whether it was effective or not effective? We should have concrete evidence. Okay, we do have some time now for questions. So as you think about your questions, I'd just like to remind everyone that task 4 is very difficult. It's often pieced together at the very end. I know everyone's tired. You've been through a long portion of your student teaching already. You've worked hard with planning and preparation and classroom management and all of your tasks 1 through 3. And now there's a task 4. So it can be overwhelming, yes. But think about all that work you put into task 1 through 3. Do you want to throw it all away with a hodgepodge in task 4? No. Task 4 should be your showcase. Now you've done all task 1 through 3. Now you can showcase your skills as a teacher in task 4. It is the most rigorous. It's the hardest to meet the expectations. It's the most frequently scored low. So you have to work very hard and diligently meeting all of the expectations in those rubrics. You have to be very specific in finding concrete evidence in your student work samples. So at this time, please raise the hand icon next to your name, and we can talk through however you're making progress on this task, or what you were thinking on your approach to this task, maybe some ideas that you have about what you're going to do next. Yeah, go ahead and raise the hand icon next to your name. I saw someone's hand popped up and then went down. So if you really want it up, please make sure that it's up. Or if you feel more comfortable, you can type in the questions box. Don't feel shy, even if you just want to talk through some ideas that you had. I want to make sure you have a very thorough understanding of what's expected. Maybe it will help if I bring up the I'll bring up the overview here for you. Here's the overview for you again. So see if that sparks any understanding or questions that you have. Do all of you have a pretty specific idea of what you'll plan to teach for the learning segment for Task 4? Do you want to share with us how you came to that topic? I'll tell you, the hardest part of this for our students is really being able to pinpoint that concrete evidence of errors, confusions, and partial understandings. So that's certainly a skill that you can work with your cooperating teacher prior to even doing this Task 4. How do you analyze student assessments? Okay, it looks like we don't have any questions or comments. So if everyone's got all of their ideas formed, I'll go ahead and close out our webinar for today. I do thank you for attending, and I hope this was beneficial for you. Oh, we do have a question. I know that we are focusing on 3 to 5 lessons, so should they all be focused on the exact same area? Fractions, measurement, double-digit multiplication, yes. The 3 to 5 lessons are a learning segment, so they're going to have the same central focus. They should show a progression in conceptual understanding. The 3 to 5 lessons for the learning segment all address a central focus. Same state standards, learning objectives, and instructional strategies. And then, when we move on to the formative assessment, you're going to be assessing the student's knowledge of the central focus that was taught in those 3 to 5 lessons. So remember when I showed you the template that you use here? This elementary mathematics learning segment overview. Do you see how on the top part of this template it shows central focus and state adopted standards? That's because central focus and state adopted standards, that portion is completed for the whole learning segment. That central focus needs to be applicable for all lessons listed there, and the state adopted standards are applicable for all of the lessons listed there on that sheet as well. And so then, when you get your assessment, the assessment shows, are the students meeting the central focus, or are there patterns of misunderstanding? And that's when we identify the concrete evidence that shows patterns of misunderstanding. And from there, we plan the re-engagement lesson to still focus on those same skills. Yes, as someone mentioned, the terminology can be confusing. It is. That's why I suggest you try to read over those terms daily or every other day so that you can become comfortable with them. Because not only is it important for you to understand the terms in the mathematics glossary, but it's also important for you to incorporate that in your commentary. Because then you'll be able to be crystal clear that you're addressing each of those expectations. Yeah, and you know, most of this pedagogy you've learned in your program. You know how to effectively plan and reteach for specific groups of students, but you may just not know how to put it in this particular format, which is what you have to do for EdTPA. So think, to effectively demonstrate that you're ready to be a teacher, you need to be able to demonstrate these capabilities in this format. So be very careful that you're following all of the instructions. Remember, this is the most rigorous task. This is where students really struggle. So keep that in mind and really try to do your best here and showcase that you're ready to be a teacher. We have another question here. So 3 to 5 lessons for learning segment and 3 to 5 lessons for re-engagement. No, there's only 1 lesson for re-engagement. Remember, we saw that in our overview here. In our task 4 flow chart, the learning segment, formative assessment, analyze student work, and then the re-engagement lesson. The re-engagement lesson is just 1 lesson. And then you'll have work samples from that re-engagement lesson. So the learning segment, you plan on that overview template, but then the re-engagement lesson plan, you have to write it out like a lesson plan. That's really where you're showcasing your ability to put together a lesson based on assessment data. Remember, you're showing that you know your students, and you're planning instruction based on your students. Just like in tasks 1 through 3, there's a big push to teach to your students. You have to consider their personal, cultural, and community assets. You have to consider their background knowledge. You have to really teach for those particular students. No more can we just do lesson plans for the sake of lesson plans. Our lesson plans have to be responsive to our student needs. And that's what the re-engagement lesson should demonstrate, that you can plan a lesson based on what you know your students need. Okay, another question has come in. So no formative assessment for the re-engagement lesson plan, just work samples. Yeah, the work samples can be formative. Remember, you can collect those in video, audio, or written format. It just depends on what works best with your students and what you feel more comfortable with. If you want to do a formative assessment and record it through video, that's fine. You just keep in mind that when you're analyzing those work samples, you'll probably want to refer to specific timestamps to pinpoint the concrete evidence. So yes, it can be formative, it can be recorded, or it can be paper, whatever works best for you. Remember though, it has to demonstrate students have conceptual understanding, computational, procedural fluency, mathematical reasoning, and problem-solving skills. Okay, so again, thank you all for attending today. It's been a pleasure. I hope this was helpful for you. I will send you a copy of this presentation, and it will be saved on our PLN. Thank you, and have a great day.